Good morning. As you can see, drilling in limestones in Ireland can be both rewarding and exciting, and it sometimes can be stressful. When you're drilling in limestones in Ireland, you're going on a trip down into the unknown. You can forget your conceptual models of predictable groundwater flow in a porous media. Instead, what you're doing is going down into a world of impermeable rock, hoping to find a water supply. Hopefully find some breaks in the rock. And it's solid rock, it's impermeable rock. Hopefully some of these breaks will have been widened by cast solution weathering. Hopefully some of these conduits, breaks in the rock, will be interconnected and you'll be able to get a water supply. In essence, you're going into a subsurface world where the groundwater flow system is taking place in a plumbing system. Imagine a series of drainage pipes, Widen pipes, underground. You're trying to hit one or more of them. This presentation provides an illustrations that support the detail in the paper that I've got in the proceedings. I can't cover everything in this presentation. I don't suggest that you read the paper right now. I suggest you keep it, and so that when you're perhaps going to get involved in some of this sort of work, you can read it beforehand, and hopefully it'll give you some pointers, some tips on how to proceed and how to set things up. The first image is making a fundamental point, and that shows that a hydrogeologist is a part of a team. Here I'm stepping in to run the rig whilst the driller is engaged on something else. Here's Oliver Higgins working in Kildare. He's helping the driller use a Symmetrex system while going into the Warsortion below the sands and gravels of the Kildare aquifer. And here's David Gagan and Bruno Taillard doing cement grouting next to the power station in Poolbeg, drilling again into the Warsortion in Dublin Bay. When you're going off into the subsurface, you're hopefully going to find something like this. This is a small crack in the limestone in Dublin, and that'll just give you a small water supply. Hopefully you can do better than that, but that's the sort of thing that you're aiming for. But you can see there's a solid mass of rock around it. Here's a small conduit with iron staining on the inside of it, and you can see a whole lot of closed cracks all around. This is again in the Warsortion. You might be lucky, you might find something like this with a 200mm diameter conduit in the limestones in Lanesborough. That'll give you 2 or 3 million litres a day. That's for borehole camera image. You may find that your borehole goes into the open cast cavities shown on the right hand side there, or a few inches away you could put your borehole into the part of the cavity that's full of clay, and you may get a water supply, or you may have to get the clay out of the water supply. So these are some of the things that you might encounter. The other main thing is that you're going to encounter heterogeneity. Here we're drilling a borehole, and the water and mud coming up the borehole is actually finding it easier to go along a cave which connects to an Expiration borehole that we drilled before, and that's why the water is rising up out of that black pipe on the right hand side. And to give you an idea of how dramatic it can be, that's a few minutes later. My car in the background did survive. One of the other important things before doing any drilling is you must clarify your expectations of the client. Some clients perceive us as basically scientific versions of water dryners. Thank you, Richard Langford, for this photograph. They seem to think that we can magic water out of the ground in any site that they happen to choose. With a new client or an inexperienced engineer, you need to put an effort into ensuring that they understand that on a new, unexplored site, it's not sensible or logical to expect that anyone could know whether or not there's an open interconnected fracture exactly in the path of a new borehole. You make it clear that your job is to work with the driller to make the best decisions in the light of the evidence that you develop any potential that you and the drilling team encounter. The best clients are clients, for example, like Michael O'Hora and Stan Cullen from Laois County Council, who will come to the site and actually work with you and begin to understand all of the thought processes, all the observations, the measurements, the care that's taken when trying to construct a borehole in limestones in Ireland. Another example of a very good client would be someone like James O'Callaghan with a hat on the left. May James rest in peace. He died on the 2nd of October 2008 in a drowning accident. But here, having spent 10 years observing, watching and working with us, he's actually taken over my job and is explaining to Barry Martin, who's Head of Water Services in Limerick County Council, all about a down the hole hammer. Another important, essential practical point to make is that it's important to ensure that you actually get an arrangement or a contract with the driller that actually gives you the capacity to be able to make proper decisions during the course of the construction work. The hydrogeologist should negotiate the agreement with the drilling contractor on behalf of the client. I strongly recommend that you don't get involved in carrying out a scope of work and specifications for drilling in limestones that's been put together by somebody else who's never actually directed groundwater work in such conditions. Do not accept a specification for a job that involves drilling a final production borehole where the depths and the diameters and the yield and the ancillary tests are all determined and priced in advance. Instead, I suggest you work on what's called a working day rate, where the drilling contractor provides all the agreed equipment, the fuel, insurances to carry out such work as is necessary and agreed in the light of the findings as the work progresses, and provides the materials at cost, plus 5% for ordering and delivery. It's much simpler. Rather than trying to specify everything in advance, just get a good driller who's got experience that you're happy to work with, because remember, you're part of a team, and pay on a day rate basis. This gives you the flexibility to do whatever is necessary to actually construct the work or do the work properly. Here's an example, for example, of how simple it is to to measure such work. You can see that the hours are just measured on for the work each day, and the materials are at the bottom there. When you do a desk study before you get work on the site, you may get the impression that the geology is simple. It might indicate that the site is underlain by a sort of monotonous layer of shaly limestones, or it might indicate it's massive limestones, let's say like the Walsaucian, which hopefully might have a fault in it. You've got overburden sitting over bedrock. This shows you that you're actually going into a rock which doesn't really have much water in it. You might be lucky if you hit the fault, but it demonstrates the uncertainty of work in limestones. One of the other things that's important to remember is that the geological maps tends to show hard boundaries between two different rock types, and that gives the impression that on the left, if you drill a hole, you're just drilling into the alumwood. On the right of a fault, if you drill a hole, you're just drilling into the calc limestone. However, don't give up. Don't assume that, because this is more likely what you're going to find. Remember, these limestones were laid down at the same time under different conditions, and they interfinger between them. So if you go into the calc and you don't get any water, as I did, for example, in just south of Port Arlington, drill on, and you find you've got a borehole which will give you 1 million litres a day. As you don't know precisely what you're going to do, what you're going to find in that narrow sample of a 6-inch or 8-inch or 10-inch hole, it's wise not to drill a production borehole immediately. The best thing to do is to drill an exploration borehole. The following illustrations show roughly the sequence and way of doing that. I've chosen this slide here as a sort of a background which I'll keep with all of the illustrations. It shows overburden, which is like boulder clay, an epicast, and a folded bedded limestones of both clean and muddy and shaly varieties. It may be there's a fault in it. Maybe that fault has also been exploited by karst solution weathering, and there's further karst solution weathering down at depth. You don't know this before you start. Here are some diameters, just to give you an idea of the different diameters I'm going to show in the course of these illustrations. They're in inches because that's what we tend to use when we're drilling. There's obviously huge vertical and horizontal distortions in these diagrams. The first step is to drill down through the overburden with a down the hole hammer, down through the epicast until you've got to stable rock. Then you take the hammer out and you put some casing in. The important thing about this is you may want to take that casing out, so don't drive it into the rock. Don't hammer it in. That's why we're drilling at 8-inch diameter and putting a 6-inch casing with a view that if this hole is successful, we can take this casing back out. Then you drill on and you start to find you're going into a few small fractures. You're starting to get a feel for what you're getting involved in. While you're doing that, this is what you need to be doing is looking very carefully at the cuttings that are coming out. This is ordinary cuttings from an ordinary limestone. You need to be looking to see if there's any sign of weathering or any sign of movement of water through the rock on the small fractures in joints in the bedding. This is again the same. There are a few fragments here of pale looking, possibly calcite, but otherwise there's not a huge amount of sign of weathering. There's one little bit of clay down in the bottom of it. But this is the sort of thing you're looking for. Can you see all the iron staining on the side of the cuttings there? You can see that some of the rock is also, some of the cuttings are also weathered. Keep on using your shovel. Put it underneath the place at the back of the rig and look for, as you can see in this shovel here, you can see a few specimens of clay, which are hard clay that's probably been washed out of some small joint, showing that the rock has been weathered. You also can see there's a lot of calcite, but you can't see any iron staining on the calcite. It doesn't look as if that calcite, which is possibly a fracture going through the rock, it doesn't look as if water has actually dissolved that limestone, that calcite. Here's an example of me looking at a shovel of a dolomite which has been very heavily weathered. It's almost become like sugar, some of this. When it comes up, sometimes it's sandy. You can actually almost begin to believe in porous media when you see this stuff. We find that this is very productive, but also sometimes can be unstable. Here's an example of just a sieve used, and you can see again on the calcite here the iron staining. That shows that water has moved down that fracture and there is potential for water supply there. This is an example of the clay that I found once in a borehole coming from a cave, and I sliced it with my penknife, and you can see how it's bedded and layered. This is typical of the clay that you find laid down in a paleokarst cavity, which might be highly productive, but when you are airlifting, when you're drilling, you find that you're ripping large lumps of clay off, and these are some of the examples which came up in the drilling. This is the beginning of going into a karst cavity that has got clay in it. This is the oxide clay that you find quite often laid down in cavities, and here there's very little water coming out. It shows the cavity is probably nearly completely full of clay, but if you stop and you work at it, you keep on surging and things like this, this is what will start to happen. You start to get some flow coming through, and then if you keep on working at it, you start to get more flow. So when you see stuff like this, it's a time for celebration. It's a time for excitement, because at last you're going into a plumbing system, albeit slightly clogged with clay, where potentially you can get a lot of water out of it. And you end up with things like this, where you can get, this is a borehole where, having worked it over, we ended up with about 2 million litres a day, around about 80 cubic metres an hour. When you've gone through clay cavities, you may find you're going back into cuttings that come out grey like this. Don't be dismayed, don't be put off, persist, because once you've found a set of cavities, you may find that there are more below, and it's worthwhile proceeding. Here's another feature that may puzzle you when you're drilling. You see at in the pool here next to the line of gravel, a line of cuttings, you see a sort of a black stain. It looks like oil on the surface. Here's a more dramatic example of it. It's actually not oil. It's carbon from shales. And sometimes you also get this black color and this sort of monomolecular layer when you've also drilled into pyrite in shales. Sometimes you can tell this by the smell. Don't worry about it. It's sometimes it actually can be an indicator, because the formation is changing, that you might get some more water below the shales. This borehole here gave about 500,000 litres a day, and you can see behind. This is just a dramatic photograph to show that when we were actually cleaning that same borehole with foam, and the foam was sort of settling and the bubbles were all bursting, we got these different layers of black monomolecular layer of carbon on the foam. Another feature that you might find is that when you're going into limestones that's been tertiary, very, very ancient cast, you find tertiary deposits. You might find pinks and blues and purples and greens and oranges, which are not typical of fairly recent cast sediment clays. These are often very hard clays, and they were looked at. Well, we found some in the Bog of Allen, for example, and they were dated as being tertiary. So if you find that it's not Devonian, it can actually be residual tertiary deposits embedded in the limestone itself. Another thing you should be doing, thank you Michael Gill for this photograph, is trying to measure the penetration rate. What I'm doing there is I've got my elbow on the boss on the plate there, and I'm holding my hand steady as the drilling rig is working and the drill rods are going down. They are rotating, and I'm just holding my hand in one position, and I'm marking with chalk the amount that goes down for each rotation. Here's a close-up example of something similar. It shows ordinary hard limestone. This is actually in the Walsaution. Hard, clean limestone, even drilling, roughly 1 centimetre per rotation. Where suddenly, here we're going into very weathered, dolomitized Walsaution, and it's about to become sugary, it's about to become very productive. And you can see there we're going down about 3 centimetres per rotation. You can also see the little ripples on the line. Those are the individual hammer blows per rotation. You can actually work out how many hammer blows per rotation if you count those. Going back to the borehole, this is the exploration hole. You've gone all the way down to, let's say, 100 meters. You found that there's clay and sand in the fractures and the cavities. You then airlift it and you try and flush that the clay and sand out of the cavities in order to improve the yield. This is the sort of thing that you'll find when you've been doing that. You can see these are lumps of hard clay coming up with the cuttings flushed out. You're able to get some idea of the yield when you've done this, and you can see how these cavities are also being cleaned out, and your yield will develop with this. So that then, this is an example of airlift surging when the borehole is by and large clean. So you then have an exploration borehole with an 8-inch casing in it, which is productive. Now you can make the decision about whether to make that into a production borehole, and obviously in this case it is successful, so you should do so. So what do you do? Well, first of all, you do a pumping test to try and determine the drawdown and the sustainable yield. Just a short pumping test is necessary here, and this gives you the information for designing the production borehole. So use the understanding you gain during the drilling and the yield tests to design your production borehole. And the first step is to dismantle and widen the exploration borehole. You do this by pulling out a casing. You can see in the sequence of 3 here how the bottom clamp is clamping onto the steel casing, then pulling it up, then releasing it, going down again to grab hold of it, again to pull it up. That's the way to pull out casing. You should use a rig if you can that has got that capacity. This is a 12-inch hammer which you're going to use, having pulled the casing out, To start to create a hole which will enable you to put in the pump chamber casing, you've decided, as described in the paper, that you're going to use a 6-inch pump, you're going to use an 8-inch OD casing, therefore you need to be able to get a 2-inch annulus at least around that for proper cement grouting, so you're going to go in with a 12-inch hammer. Here we are going down to the bottom of the epicast, then putting in 12-inch casing. Here you can put it in and ram it in if you want to. Then here it is in profile, and what I've done there is I've backfilled with gravel up to the bottom of the 12-inch casing. The idea of that is so that the 12-inch bit, which is going to continue drilling, is able to bite into the rock, but it's also got something fairly solid in the middle, but also the gravel is going to be important with the grouting in a moment. The 12-inch hammer takes you down to the 35 meters, which is where we decided you're going to put in the pump chamber casing. You then take the hammer out, you then put in your PVC pump chamber casing. You then put some sand at the bottom of the PVC pump chamber casing around the bottom there to try and stop or to ensure that any grout you put in the annulus doesn't go inside the casing. The gravel below that is preventing grout going down the rest of the hole. There are lots of different ways of grouting, but this is a very simple, secure way of doing it. It doesn't take very much time to actually put gravel into a 6-inch hole and backfill it like we have done here. That's the casing and profile. Then you put in a tremie pipe, which is bound to about 1 meter above the top of the sand around the bottom of the pump chamber casing. Connect that to the grout pump, and this is just showing the water in it. Naturally, you've got water on the inside and the outside at the same level. You then grout, and grout in, probably because it's 35 meters, you might do it in 2 stages, like this. Because you've got to be conscious of the compression strength of the casing and the weight and pressure of the grout, you then actually, be a good idea to fill up the inside of the casing with water. Then you pull out the tremie pipe to above where you've just grouted, because that grout is starting to go off, and then you grout again, and you grout up to the surface. Then you go back in, and all you need to do is to clean out the 6-inch hole. Because a 6-inch hole, the yield from a 6-inch hole depends upon the size of the conduits that you've intersected with the 6-inch hole. You don't get a higher yield by having a wider diameter. And you can get an awful lot of water up a 6-inch hole, so you don't need to re-drill for a production borehole. You can just literally gently clean out using either a 6-inch or a 4-inch hammer. And you go down and you keep on flushing, you keep on working it over to try and improve the yield of the hole. Then you come up inside the casing, do some airlifting just to see what the yield is. The yield will be less than when you've got the hammer at the bottom of the hole. Then you put in a pump, and you can do pumping tests, and there you have it, basically an exploration borehole converted into production borehole. That's the end. And I think, in summary, in conclusion, I think that the water supply borehole exploration and development in Ireland requires a combination of a good driller, an experienced driller with powerful equipment, the full-time supervision of a hydrogeologist or groundwater engineer, an engaged client with realistic expectations, and an arrangement or a contract with the driller that allows adaptation and yet ensures fair payment to the driller. It's normal to be anxious about the uncertainty of drilling, but all the hydrogeologist and the driller can do is use all their skill to make the best for the client of the opportunities in the subsurface as they present themselves during the work. Each hole is different, a lot is learnt every time, but the main thing about it is and can be exciting and fun.